The fading sunlight bathed the restaurant in golden hues, casting soft shadows across the neatly arranged tables. The quiet hum of conversation blended with the clinking of plates and the faint hiss of the coffee machine. It was the kind of evening that promised nothing out of the ordinary, just another day slipping into night. Alan, the restaurant manager, leaned over the counter, reviewing receipts with the precision of a man who ran his establishment like clockwork. He was meticulous, almost to a fault. His restaurant wasn't just a business to him. It was a reflection of his values, neutral, orderly, and above all, a space where no disruptions were tolerated. Dinner rush had come and gone, leaving behind a few lingering patrons. A family of 4 sat in the corner, sharing a modest meal, their laughter subdued but warm. Nearby, a young couple whispered across their table, their hands occasionally brushing together as they sipped on steaming cups of coffee. Alan's staff moved quietly, clearing tables and refilling glasses, their steps light on the tiled floor. The evening carried a sense of calm, kind that settled into the bones after a long day. But that calm shattered the moment the door opened, and the bell above it chimed softly. Alan looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the young man who had just walked in. First glance, there was nothing unusual about him. Tall and lean, he wore a simple white shirt tucked into dark jeans. His hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that was almost disarming. But then Alan's gaze dropped to the bright red hat in the young man's hand, and his stomach tightened. The bold white letters, MAGA, stood out starkly against the crimson fabric. It was a symbol that had sparked countless debates and controversies, a lightning rod for emotions on all sides of the political spectrum. Alan's jaw tightened. His restaurant was a sanctuary, a place where people could escape the chaos of the outside world. He had a strict policy against anything that could disrupt that peace, and to him, that hat was a disruption waiting to happen. The young man stepped further into the restaurant, his eyes scanning the room with a calm, measured gaze. He seemed unaffected by the whispers that had already started among the patrons. A couple in the corner exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Alan straightened his posture, forcing himself to maintain his composure. He prided himself on his professionalism, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest. "Good evening," the young man said, his voice polite and steady. Alan nodded briskly. "Good evening. How many in your party?" "Just me," the young man replied, offering a faint smile. Alan hesitated, his eyes flickering back to the hat. He felt the weight of the room pressing down on him, the silent judgment of his patrons as they waited to see what he would do. Finally, he cleared his throat and stepped out from behind the counter. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone firm but measured. "I'm afraid we can't serve you tonight." The room fell into a hushed silence. The young man stood still, his expression unreadable. He didn't react with shock or anger, nor did he look surprised. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his blue eyes meeting Alan's with a calm intensity. "May I ask why?" he said, his tone even. Alan's palms felt clammy, but he held his ground. "We have a policy against political symbols," he explained, gesturing toward the hat. "It's to ensure the comfort of all our guests." The explanation sounded reasonable enough to him, but even as he said the words, a pang of doubt crept into his mind. Was he making the right call? The young man nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "I see," he said simply. Alan had expected resistance, maybe even indignation. He had braced himself for an argument, for the kind of heated exchange that could spiral out of control. But instead, the young man's reaction was calm, almost disarmingly so. For a moment, Alan didn't know what to do. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Around the room, patrons shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Alan and the young man. Then, breaking the silence, the young man reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. From the wallet, he took out a credit card and handed it to Alan. "For the family in the corner," he said, his voice as steady as before. He gestured toward the modestly dressed family of 4, the parents quietly chatting while their children giggled over shared desserts. "Cover their bill, and if there's anything left, put it toward the next family who might need it." Alan blinked, caught off guard. You don't want to order anything for yourself?" The young man shook his head. "No, thank you, but please make sure they're taken care of." With that, he turned and walked toward the door. His movements were smooth, unhurried, as though he was entirely unbothered by the interaction. The bell above the door jingled softly as it swung shut behind him, leaving the room in stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Alan stared at the credit card in his hand, his mind racing. Around the room, the whispers began to pick up again. But this time they carried a different tone. Patrons exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something softer, admiration perhaps, or quiet respect. Alan walked over to the corner table where the family sat unaware of what had just transpired. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "The gentleman who just left," he said, his voice quieter than usual. He paid for your meal, and he left something extra for someone else who might need it. The mother's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. Why would he do that? She whispered, her voice trembling. Alan didn't have an answer. He simply handed back the credit card, his grip tighter than it needed to be. He didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness was about to ripple far beyond the walls of his restaurant. By the next morning, the restaurant had returned to its usual routine. The chairs were aligned perfectly, the cutlery gleamed in the faint sunlight streaming through the windows, and Alan had resumed his place behind the counter. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different, heavier, as though the events of the previous evening had left an imprint that no amount of routine could erase. Alan hadn't expected the story to follow him beyond the walls of his restaurant. He hadn't anticipated the curious stares of a few customers, who seemed to linger longer than usual, as though searching for traces of the moment they'd read about. And he certainly hadn't expected his phone to buzz nonstop, flooded with messages from friends, family, and even old acquaintances who had seen the story plastered across social media. It had started with a single post, a blurry photo of the young man standing by the door, his red MAGA hat loosely gripped in one hand. Beneath the photo was a caption: Barron Trump refused service, leaves behind a gift for a family in need. The post exploded. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Headlines popped up like wildfire. Barron Trump's quiet act of kindness stuns restaurant patrons. A son of controversy shows grace beyond words, rejected but not resentful. Barron Trump's generosity goes viral. Alan scrolled through the comments, his stomach twisting with every word. Some praised Barron's grace, marveling at his composure and generosity. This is the kind of story we need more of. Simple kindness in the face of rejection. Say what you want about his family, but this was pure class. Others weren't so kind. This manager should be ashamed. Who turns someone away for a hat? Another example of unnecessary division in the world. Alan felt a pang of guilt that he couldn't shake. He had done what he thought was right at the time, but seeing the story from the perspective of those who hadn't been there made him question his decision. His mind replayed the young man's calm expression, his quiet acceptance of the situation, and his unexpected gesture of kindness. By mid-morning, the phone at the restaurant was ringing off the hook. Some callers were curious, others angry. A few simply wanted to confirm if the story was true. Yes, Alan told one particularly persistent journalist. He paid for the family's meal and left something extra. That's all I have to say. But it wasn't enough. The story had already grown legs of its own, and there was no stopping it now. Alan found himself watching the restaurant differently that day. The usual chatter of diners felt quieter, more subdued, as though everyone was aware that something remarkable had taken place within these walls. The staff, too, moved with an unusual energy, their conversations peppered with whispers about last night. One of the servers, a young woman named Claire, approached Alan hesitantly. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan nodded, his expression grim. "It's true." Claire's eyes widened. "I can't believe he just did that and left." Alan shrugged, though the weight on his shoulders was undeniable. "Neither can I." Later that afternoon, a man walked into the restaurant holding a camera. He introduced himself as a journalist and immediately began asking questions. Alan bristled at the intrusion, but managed to maintain his composure. "We're not looking for publicity," he said firmly. "It was a private moment, and we'd like to keep it that way." The journalist nodded, though Alan could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "People are drawn to stories like this," the man said. "They need to be reminded that kindness still exists, especially in times like these." Alan didn't respond. He simply returned to his work. But the journalist's words lingered in his mind. Was this what people needed? A moment of grace in a world so often divided? As the day wore on, the ripple effect of Barron's actions became increasingly clear. Customers left larger tips than usual, often with notes scribbled on napkins. "For the next person who needs it, pay it forward. Kindness matters." By the end of the evening, the staff gathered in the back, sharing stories of the day's unusual energy. Even Alan, who rarely participated in such conversations, found himself listening intently. "Do you think he knew?" Claire asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Knew what?" Alan replied. "That his gesture would inspire all of this." Alan thought for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't think he did it for that reason. I think he just saw an opportunity to be kind and took it." The words felt heavier as he said them, carrying a truth that Alan hadn't fully realized until that moment. Kindness didn't have to be loud or showy. It didn't have to be planned. Sometimes it was as simple as seeing a need and choosing to fill it. That night, as Alan locked up the restaurant, he couldn't help but reflect on the lesson he had learned. He had been so focused on maintaining order, on avoiding disruptions, that he had forgotten the value of human connection. Barron's quiet act of grace had reminded him, and everyone else, that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the biggest impact. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through Alan's office window as he sat at his desk, staring at the news article displayed on his computer screen. The headline read, "Barron Trump's act of kindness sparks a movement. Below it was the now famous image of the note Barron had written, shared millions of times across social media. Alan leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. He had read every article, every comment, every opinion piece that had emerged over the last 24 hours. Some praised Barron's gesture, holding it up as an example of grace in an increasingly divided world. Others criticized Alan himself, questioning his decision to turn Barron away. Alan couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind, the calmness in Barron's demeanor, the way he had quietly chosen kindness over confrontation. It had been humbling, to say the least. Alan, a man who prided himself on control and order, had been shown a different kind of strength, one rooted in empathy. The restaurant had been busier than ever since the story broke. People came not just for the food, but to experience the place where the now viral moment had occurred. They left larger tips, shared kind words with the staff, and in some cases, even paid for strangers' meals. It was as though Barron's gesture had unlocked something in people, a reminder that small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. But for Alan, the attention felt heavy. It wasn't the kind of spotlight he had ever wanted for his business. He valued his privacy, his ability to keep things running smoothly without unnecessary distractions. And yet, here he was, at the center of a story that had taken on a life of its own. The sound of the restaurant doorbell jingling pulled Alan from his thoughts. He glanced out the window and saw a small group of reporters gathering outside. Their cameras and microphones glinted in the sunlight, a stark reminder that this story wasn't going away anytime soon. With a sigh, Alan stood and made his way to the front of the restaurant. As he approached the door, Claire intercepted him, her face etched with concern. "They're here for you," she said quietly. "They want to know your side of the story." Alan hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. "I don't know if I have a side," he admitted. Claire tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe they just want to hear what you've learned," she said gently. "What we've all learned." Her words struck a chord, and Alan nodded. He pushed open the door, stepping out into the sunlight as the reporters turned their attention toward him. "Mr. Alan Marks?" one of them called out. "Yes," Alan replied, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "Can you tell us about the moment you refused service to Barron Trump, and how you feel about his gesture now?" Alan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "When Barron Trump walked into my restaurant, I made a decision that I thought was in the best interest of my customers. At the time, I believed it was the right thing to do. But what happened after that, well, it taught me something I didn't expect." The reporters leaned in, their pens poised. "I saw a young man who could have reacted with anger or frustration. Instead, he chose kindness. He chose grace. He didn't argue or try to prove a point. He simply made a quiet gesture that has inspired so many people, myself included." Alan paused, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. "If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that kindness has a way of breaking down walls. It doesn't need to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet acts, the ones no one expects, that have the greatest impact." The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras clicking as they captured Alan's reflective expression. One of them stepped forward. "Do you have a message for Barron Trump?" Alan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "If he's watching, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you for reminding me, and everyone else, that kindness still matters. You've made a bigger difference than you might realize." As the reporters dispersed, Alan returned to the restaurant, feeling a strange sense of relief. He had spoken his truth, and for the first time since the story broke, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Later that evening, as the restaurant began to wind down, Alan watched his staff move through the space with a renewed energy. The ripple effect of Barron's gesture was still palpable, not just in the customers' actions, but in the way his team carried themselves. Claire approached him as he stood by the counter, her expression soft. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" she asked. Alan shrugged. Maybe not. But whether he comes back or not, he's left his mark here." Claire smiled. "He sure has." As the last customers of the night filtered out and the staff began their closing routines, Alan found himself lingering by the door. He stared out at the quiet street, the memory of that evening replaying once more in his mind. Barron Trump hadn't just changed the narrative in the restaurant. He had reminded everyone that even in the smallest moments, there's an opportunity to choose kindness. And sometimes that choice could inspire brighter days, not just for one person, but for many. Alan locked the door and turned off the lights, feeling a quiet sense of peace. The day had been long, the journey unexpected, but it had taught him a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness truly do have the power to change the world.